hard day, but fine.
Hard day at work?
Yeah, it's a different thing in production. A lot of stuff to check to be sure that we can support the number of requests for the day. It's good. That's okay.
Sounds rough.
Yeah.
But it also sounds like you got it under control.
Yeah. Now, yes.
Nice. So the system is scalable.
Yes, but not scalable as I want.
Okay, so there's always room for improvement.
Yeah, and it's because also I have some technical debt. I have to rewrite some element, transform all my code to .NET Core to be sure that I can scale on the AKS cluster because I have a lot of container in Windows container, and Windows container are just hell because just as startups they use a lot of memory and CPU. So
Got it.
we have to move everything, but it takes time.
Yeah, that's usually the thing with this sort of things. Well, it sounds like they got your work cut out for you, my friend. All right, well, let's forget about all of that. Let's work on some fun stuff.
Yeah.
All right, speaking of fun, I have a couple of topics. API key authentication. So that's a new functionality of the identity module, which in itself has seen a few new enhancements, allowing you to define users through app settings or from a store, and the same goes for roles. And it allows you to create applications which are similar to users, but instead of using a username password, it allows you to store a client ID and secret, plus an API key that you then can use from your own application to invoke Elsa API endpoints. So I thought it might be cool to go through that. Just a small update on stability improvements for Elsa overall. So the past 2 weeks, I've been trying to get a workflow for a customer fully functioning in Elsa 3. And it's a very, very complicated workflow with lots of eventing and webhooks. So it's a very interesting use case because it touches so many points of the framework. So there's a lot of scenarios that I get to try out. And as you go through these scenarios, you run into all sorts of things that have been missed or that didn't work out so well. So it's been very good exercise to identify those issues and then fix them. So at this point, it's in a pretty good state. I was able to run the entire workflow from start to end, which also includes composite workflows and sub workflows. So it's a good use case. There's one issue that I identified today, and since we're looking at it, let me show you. And that's the following. So maybe you remember at some point we were testing the implicit joins.
Yeah.
So this works nicely, but there's another kind of construct that doesn't work nice at all, or it has an issue. And let me show it. Let me start the server first. All right, so let me open that workflow again. All right, so what we should expect to see here is, of course, write line 1 prints first, then this one, this one, this one, this one, this one, and then this one, like this. Well, not like this. This is either because my debugger or my build uses an older build. Let me try again.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you see at the bottom, the source, blah, 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 may have changed. So it didn't build correctly. So let me build again. All right, second go, right? So this is okay.
Yeah.
1, 4, etc. So this works, but let me show you the issue. If we go to another workflow here, so this is a little bit different. It has one join, as you can see here, it's an implicit join. But the issue here is that when this starts, so it goes like this, so it goes through the increment counter, which is a simple set variable, which will increment a variable called counter by 1. And this is a flow decision, so it's like an if-else. And initially it will evaluate to false because counter is not greater than 1. It will be 1, so not greater than. So it goes through false, then it's going to print retry, which is connecting to do something, which is just the right line, and then increment the counter again. This time the counter is 2, so that's greater than 1, so it evaluates true, and then this one gets executed. However, all these activities, they are part of this flowchart that we don't see, but it's the root activity of this workflow. So these execute within a flowchart. But this flowchart now in this construct never completes, and that has to do with the logic of counting which one have executed to implement the implicit join. And what happens is that using the current implementation is that this execution counter is 1, this one will be 2, this one will be 2, this one will be 2. But the logic that it executed here to determine if the flowchart completed takes it takes a look at all of the counts of the activities, and if they're not the same, then it's not considered complete. So it's a very simple bit of logic that's implemented. So it needs a little bit more fine tuning to get right.
Okay.
Yeah, and so my initial attempt was where I thought, well, if we notice that we are at a join-like activity, so if it's, it may not be a join, but as soon as it has more than one inbound paths, then we consider it a join. But if it's not a join, well, this is considered the implicit join. And maybe I figured let's just clear the scope. And if I do that, so now I'm going to execute this workflow. Okay, this is something very tricky. If you're not careful, sometimes this happens when you think you start, or when you start the application without debug mode, you will not notice whether it's using a stale build or not.
Yes.
So that's why I always like to do the debugger attach when I make a change, because now at least I get notified about that. You can't imagine how much time I've wasted just not understanding why a change didn't have an effect because of this.
It is a JetBrains?
Yeah, it could be. I don't know. Although I think JetBrains uses MS Build or .NET.
But does it support how to reload?
To a certain extent, I think. But I don't know how good it is compared to Visual Studio. But it's quite possible that it's just a little bit buggy. I wonder if Visual Studio has something similar. Do you use Visual Studio?
Yeah.
Never run into this issue?
No.
And it's probably Writer. All right, so here I executed this workflow, and the issue was, if we look at so it executes correctly, that wasn't the issue, but the issue is that it wouldn't finish the workflow. But with this change, it finishes the workflow. But because of that change, if I now go to the other workflow, the workflow 2, and execute this one, notice what will happen. It just writes line 1 and line 4, and then it stops. And it makes sense given this change. So it needs some more tinkering to get right for both scenarios. But that's the thing I'm currently facing. Lots of other fixes have gone in, so pretty cool. One of the UI developers made a little change here. Notice the notifications. It's a little bit fast, so it's hard to see. But when I publish, it briefly shows a spinner and then updates notification. And all of the notifications can be seen here, which is pretty cool. So it's just like the Azure portal.
Yes.
Or close to it, at least.
I think that there is a good, very good hook on the publish event. When I work on the Angular wrapper, I succeed to attach to the event, and the event is developed with 2 hooks: start, publish, and published. And so we can, in other components, create a different interaction during the publish. So that's cool.
That's cool. Yeah. Yeah, that's helpful for these sort of scenarios, I imagine. I
was wondering, the execution graph is calculated at runtime after each activity execution?
Let's see. I think at the time the workflow execution context starts. So not activity execution, but workflow context execution. Let's see here. I think when this one is constructed, we already get a graph call from the factory. So I think, yeah. So whatever you construct a workflow execution context using the workflow execution context factory, it builds a graph based on your root activity, which is typically the workflow.
Okay.
And then it goes into all of the activity properties of your activity. So let's say you have a flowchart which has a list of activities, so it's gonna recursively drill into each of those and then build up this complete graph of your workflow.
Okay, and then you use this graph to know that you have to, for example, in your workflow 1, the workflow with the counter, you have to come back because the counter is less than 1. So you have to go in your implicit loop, or here you have to go from right line 2, etc., etc.
Actually, that logic lives entirely in flowchart. So the workflow engine doesn't know about any of this. It's completely scoped to the flowchart, and the way it works, it internally stores a flow scope instance, which is also specific to flowchart. So it stores it as part of its own activity execution context. So it's very locally scoped, which is good because it means it's isolated, and it also is a good example of different kinds of diagrams that you may implement, like BPMN, for example, would be completely different. It would just be an activity, but all of the BPMN stuff would be isolated to its own activity.
Okay.
Yeah, and here I'm just storing in the flow scope, I'm storing a dictionary of activities keyed by the owner activity, which I think is just the flowchart, and then some state, which includes just an execution count. And then I'm doing some operations to determine if the implied joining activity should continue or should be scheduled or not, and that all lives here.
Okay.
All right, let's see what we have here. So that's quick note and stability improvements. So we haven't actually looked at the ones, but they're so detailed. I don't think it's worth going through them, other than the one that I was looking at right now, API key authentication. So let's let me show you that. All right, let's see how to start. Maybe just let's consider one of the API endpoints. Let's say we want to execute some workflow definition. So let's see what we have. Say we have workflow 1. This is just an HTTP response, and it writes test. That's good. So let's take this definition ID, and then so we put it in here, and then we can execute. But we need authorization, and right now it's set to API key. But before this change, what you had to do is set it to bearer token and get an access token. And how would you get an access token? You would have to log in as some user. So for example, as the admin, which requires you to send a username and a password, right? And then you get an access token, which we can use. And this script sets it in an access token Postman variable. So here with this setup, it will use that token, and we get indeed a successful execution. But of course, maybe if you are building your own applications that integrate with Elsa server through REST APIs, it would be inconvenient to have, I mean, it's possible, but it would be inconvenient to have to first use this login API where you need to provide a username and password. So you would have to create a user for your application, and also take into account that the access token will expire at some point, depending on how you configured the token issuance. You could, of course, generate tokens that expire hundreds of years from now, but it doesn't feel as good as just having a API key that you can use, right? So it's just a different approach, and I think makes more sense for application to application. Also depends on your tolerance for risk, because having an API key that never expires automatically could pose a risk. But then again, if you know that your API key is leaked, you can always revoke your API key centrally. So yeah, to that end, I created support for API keys, and the way that works, you need to, instead of creating a user, or in addition to creating a user, you just create an application. So here we could create an application called Postman to represent this client with a set of roles, and each role is associated with permissions. And the admin role that I created somewhere, I don't see an API endpoint here. But in any case, the system has a role called admin, and it has the asterisk permission, which means it has all the permissions of the entire system. So it's a very powerful user. So you can create one, and what it will create is, of course, a primary key, the name and the roles. It creates a client ID and secrets, which you could use similar to logging in with a user name and password. You can then also use this to log in if you prefer this kind of authentication. And this will, if you do that, you will get an access token, but probably you'll just want to store this one encrypted or yeah, probably at least encrypted or in a location that's not stored in clear text in your source code. For you wouldn't want that. Maybe stored in a hashed fashion. That doesn't work. You have to encrypt it or store it securely, like in a Kubernetes secret, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Internally, the application stores the hashed version. So Elsa doesn't store this. It just sends it now because it created it, but it's not stored anywhere. It's just for you to grab, and it will never be shown anywhere again. It's not recoverable.
Okay.
But yeah, so here I think I copied this one into an API key environment variable. So now we can execute, instead of using var tokens, we can use now API keys. There's one caveat. I didn't set up this server with persistent storage for the identity module.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, what I did, I installed, let's see, I installed a configuration-based user provider, application provider, and role provider. And what
Okay.
that means is that it's reading it from configuration. So for example, app settings or your environment variables or whatever configuration sources you have installed, it will consider those sources. In this case, I use app settings here. So here I've hard-coded my admin role
Mm-hmm.
with this
Okay.
permission, right? And then an admin user and just this application. I don't know what the API key is, so I will have to update these settings with what I just generated. This. So let me just copy this over, and of course I will remove this because this is not. This shouldn't be stored, and it won't be stored if you use the persistence provider. Of course, you can store whatever you want in app settings. Not recommended, so let's not do that. Yeah, and this API key, of course, was already set in the Postman variable. So if I restart this application, because I'm not using options monitor or anything, so I have to restart the application for these application settings to take into effect.
Okay.
Right, and now when I run this one, it works using API keys, which won't expire until you remove it. And this is an interesting part because the API key, or when you use an access token, all of your permissions, or roles at least, are actually permissions. They are encoded and stored in your access token. So the server doesn't have to fetch doesn't have to compute your roles because it's not associated with roles. It just already carries the permission names. But when you use an API key, it does have to do a lookup. So it's potentially it's less performant theoretically, but in practice, I don't think you will notice any difference, especially when we add a caching layer where the evaluated permissions are associated with your API key on first request, and then subsequent requests will be super fast. So it will be as fast as receiving access tokens. But yeah.
And so if you change the API key, you add just something at the end of the value, it will return a for one.
Yeah, if I change the API key, so let's say I try to tamper the API key. Let's say, let me copy this, and I will do it like this. So this should work. This is the correct API key. But now if I make a change, let's change this 1 to 2, then we get an unauthorized. Yeah.
And so we can have the user context inside the workflow. That's right.
Come again.
We can get the context of the user inside the workflow.
Yeah, like the user or the identity stuff. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because it all hooks into the standard .NET security mechanisms.
Okay.
So just for example, this API key authorization it actually uses a third-party library called ASP.NET Core Authentication API key. So it implements its own authorization handler and provides an API key scheme, etc. We could do it ourselves, but I figured it's so general purpose, easier to use what they have, because it's still a significant amount of code that you would have to maintain.
Okay, and so here we are looking for security to use the management API. It's different that use the HTTP activity to expose a workflow with security.
So if you use HTTP endpoints, that's a slightly different story, because this is not implemented as an API, as a fast endpoint or controller or anything like that. This is done using middleware.
Yeah.
So it requires a bit of custom code to actually invoke authentication. But that too relies on, by default, on the ASP.NET Core authorization API. So it works the same way, but the activity itself or the middleware associated with this explicitly has to invoke authentication and authorization. To enable that, you check this checkbox here. Optionally provide policy name, and then the middleware associated with the HTTP endpoint will evaluate this policy like this. Let me find the code here. So here we have the middleware. So it relies on or depends on IHP endpoint authorization handler. So that is a custom interface provided by Elsa. And let's see where this one is used. So here we have a private method called authorized async. This will only be invoked if authorized was checked. So if it's checked, it will call into this service. But it's like a strategy pattern. So you can provide your own implementation if you want to, but there's a default implementation out of the box that looks like this. So it's either allow anonymous or authentication based. And if you use authentication based, it depends on the ASP.NET Core iAuthentication service. So that's Microsoft ASP.NET Core authorization, and it will pass along your policy that you configured. So if you in your program file or in your startup file you configure, do services.add authorization, and then you can add policies, named policies, and configure its requirements. So that's how you can associate it.
Okay.
All right. So as I briefly touched upon, you have now the ability to create users, roles, and applications, and you can configure it from like this using app settings. But there's also persistence providers here. So we have an EF Core implementation for all of these stores. So we have an application store, role store, and user store, but we don't have any UI yet. So so that will come. So probably we'll have users or security, something like that here, and then it will take you to a screen where you can manage it. That being said, I'm not sure if I'm gonna make it part of this current SPA, because what I've been wanting to do for a long time now is create a separate modular extensible dashboard application framework that out of the box is just an empty shell with with a sidebar menu, top menu, so all of the core dashboard things. But then it's up to the modules installed with the application to provide these UI elements, like contribute menu items to the menu, which, for example, if you have the identity module installed, it will install user management menu items and screens. And it's just easier to do it with a .NET application. So this would be implemented using Blazor. So it would be easier for .NET developers to extend with their own things, because in Stencil it's just a little bit, it works, but it's also, it feels a little bit arcane in my opinion.
Yeah.
So yeah. All right.
Yeah, I am currently doing the same thing on my side with Angular, a shell, different module, UI module, and API module, hosting things differently, and the shell query what module are used and load the UI module if needed, and the UI module is bound to a specific API, so everything can work correctly and separately. It's
that sounds beautiful.
What they call this, that's a micro front-end framework.
So that's
MFE.
Interesting. So that's just a different name for a modular extensible UI framework.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So that sounds very similar, if not exactly the same as what I want to do for the dashboard, but then using Blazor instead of Stencil or React. And I think Blazor is great for .NET developers, and I also want to do the designer itself, this entire portion using Blazor, because these days it's very allegedly very straightforward to wrap it in a web component so that you can use it as a custom element. I haven't tried it, so we'll see how easy it's going to be.
Yeah.
But yeah, all right, that's all I have for the show and tell. Do you have any topics you want to go over first?
No, no specific topic. Just maybe one question, because 1 or 2 weeks ago we talked about the server sample with the persistence module, and you told me that because it used the actor module, there is no persistence of the instance workflow, and so we have to add some use workflow runtime to be sure to use the persistence of the workflow instance in the SQLite, for example. Am I wrong or not?
No, you're not wrong.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
So if
And I was just wondering if when we use the actor model and actor persistence, each actor or each parent actor can be responsible for the instance persistence. What you told me is if we use only the actor, we don't have the history of the instance execution.
exactly, yes.
Because the actor flush the instance execution log in another kind of persistence. So you need some persistence to module to log all the activity.
Yeah, so
Okay.
you're referring to execution log records, probably?
Yeah, yeah.
For the history? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you don't install this feature, then you will not have a history of the execution log record. And the same goes for workflow instances. If you want to see it persisted somewhere,
Yeah.
you have to use a thing called workflow state exporter. That's this one is an async implementation that will grab all of the updated workflow states that happen in ProtoActor and then store it in a workflow instances table in SQLite, for example. But if you don't use this and you don't use this and you use ProtoActor, then all of these things will remain in memory. Of course, as you already mentioned, each actor can create snapshots. So ProtoActor supports event-driven concepts. So if you have events that these messages that it receives, you could send it or treat them as events, and then they can be stored and then played back. So if then your cluster goes down, and you can play back from the beginning all of these events if you want to. If you don't, but you also have snapshotting. So after every snapshot, you could, if you want to, delete events up to that point, and that's configurable per ProtoActor, or not per ProtoActor, per actor, per virtual actor.
Yeah. So there is to be sure I understand well. There is a different runtime execution when we use on one hand ProtoActor, or on the other hand default runtime with SQLite persistence.
Yeah, exactly. And I can show you a quick difference between the two.
So I suppose the difference will be about the clustering. If we use the clustering in SQLite persistence, we have to add some other module, for example, backend SQL service bus backend to pass the different event control. But if we use ProtoActor, everything is already done by the actor cluster.
Yeah, for example, indeed, you don't need as much communication mechanisms like what you would have to do with the default runtime, because indeed the ProtoActor supports all different kind of communication mechanisms. Yeah, and another thing, of course, is if you use the default runtime, it will rely on a database to store its state. So as an example, this workflow states is what is used internally by the default workflow runtime. And it might, at first look, it might seem to be redundant to have workflow states and workflow instances, but the workflow instance table is optional. You only need it if you want to actually look at the instances, which is probably the case if you're using the designer. The designer depends on this table currently. So workflow states, it's intended to be internal only, and this table doesn't get created if you use protoactor, because then protoactor itself, the cluster is itself the store for states. Every grain will be storing the state. For example, here we have the workflow grain, which represents a workflow instance.
Mm-hmm.
And just a quick note, both runtime, the default runtime and the protoactor runtime, they try and share as much logic as possible through workflow host. So workflow host is agnostic in terms of the runtime provider that you use, but it contains a bit of shared logic to instantiate. What's this? An instantiation strategy. It has to do with instantiating workflow instances and to start and so there's a little bit of logic that's reused, but at this moment there's also a lot of logic that is almost the same but not quite. So I'm still trying to find or still trying to extract the reusable bits so that there's as little duplication as possible, but it's a little bit tricky. Yeah, so workflow grain, here it will start. Here's an example of starting a workflow. So it uses the workflow host to create, or actually to start a workflow, and then it stores the state internally in a private field, and that's it. And after executing a burst of execution, it will save a snapshot if that's configured. And I think right now it's I don't think I've made it configurable, but that's going to be the case. So for testing, I'm always doing snapshotting, but this will be configurable, so you can control whether you want snapshotting or not. That will be up to you.
Okay. And so if we want to use the snapshot, write all data in, for example, SQL database, or in instance store, we have to use the state exporter, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And then the management API with the designer will allow me to access the data, or I have to customize also something for the instance store?
No, so that's exactly right. So if the current implementation of the state exporter will write to workflow instances, and internally it uses iWorkflow instance store, and that's the same abstraction that's used by the management APIs.
Okay.
So you'll be able to achieve that. And what's nice is that if you have installed Elasticsearch as your workflow instance store, both the management APIs and therefore also the designer will be reading it from Elasticsearch. And of course, the state exporter will be exporting to Elasticsearch.
Okay. I will look at this, because for me it's very important to use this kind of runtime to be sure that we are able to scale very large, and to be able to use different kind of pattern. For example, if we want to implement a singleton pattern for one workflow, or fan in, fan out, or anything, or a good pattern could be also a throttling pattern.
A what pattern?
Throttling.
Shuttle.
No, throttle pattern. Throttling, yes, to limit the number of call, or number of execution. Throttle.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I know we can realize this maybe more easily with actor pattern. So, but there is some tuning to do.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I haven't gone through all of the details of what you can do with protoactor, but it's very feature rich, and it supports all sorts of useful patterns when it comes to distributed computing.
Yeah, and my idea is not just about protoactor; it's more about actor pattern in general. Because when I look into the actor model, I did different tests and on Aka.net.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I know that if I'm not wrong, the creator of protoactor is an old maintainer of Aka.net.
I think I've read that somewhere in one of his articles. Yeah.
Yes, utility we can throttle in the last utility feature. circuit breaker. It's a really a good feature when when you don't want to kill an application partner.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I gotta dig into this as well. Yeah, so yeah, I'll be very curious to learn about your learnings as you experiment with Protoactor. I've yet to run it in an actual production environment, but that won't take too long now.
Yeah.
Once I've fixed this little bug I started this session with.
For me, the idea is to start using Elsa v3 and to start the base runtime of my new runtime maybe on June, and try to release something at the end of summer.
Interesting. So what kind of application are you launching?
It's an upgrade of my SaaS application, which is an iPaaS.
Sorry, which is in what?
An iPaaS, an integration platform as a service.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that.
I already migrate my Workflow Foundation runtime to Elsa v2.
How's that working out?
Good, but I'm just on the 2.8.2 version of Elsa, and because this one is in production and there is some breaking change just after, I don't want to work hard on the gap, and I will directly jump to the v3.
Makes sense. If you're gonna have to adapt those breaking changes anyway, might as well go all the way and jump on the new and improved Elsa.
Yes.
Speaking of new and improved Elsa, what do you think about the new face of Elsa?
That's great.
Isn't it? I think it's gorgeous. I mean, if there's a new product, it needs a new face.
You don't create it using IA? No, it's a real image.
It's actually created using an AI product. Yes, and it's so cool because it's unique. As far as I can tell, it's unique, and yeah, you just have to describe more or less what you're after, and it creates a couple of images, and then yeah, this one I like this one. It was in my mind, it's a perfect fit. What Elsa should look like.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's beautiful, it's strong, it's intelligent, it's intense, it's low maintenance, hopefully.
Yes, that's true. True.
Yeah. So yeah, coming soon, Elsa 3. And let's also take a small look at what should be the next focus once we have released 3.0 officially on NuGet. I'm thinking multi-tenancy would be a big one to tackle, and BPMN. I think that's really going to put Elsa on the map, because once you have BPMN support, many people who are familiar with that, they can use familiar designer tools to create those diagrams and execute them in .NET applications easily. Plus, speaking of AI, talking about ChatGPT and similar tools, it won't be long until they can also, and maybe that's already possible, when they can just, based on natural language input, create BPMN process diagrams, right? So you can just describe the process that you want. In fact, I don't know if you have seen a Copilot from Office 365. They also did a demo with Power Tools, and they demoed somebody typing in some requirements for a process, and it created a Power Tool workflow. It looked like Logic Apps. I think it's the same underlying engine. So similarly, you will start to see those tools for BPMN, is my expectation, which also means that soon enough we'll be able to create processes for Elsa through BPMN first, but then as a hobby project, I'm also going to see what it might take to create Elsa specific notation.
Yes, we always need a runtime to execute the BPMN process.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that will be there, but creating the BPMN, that's going to be easier and easier. And then the next step, of course, would be for this modular dashboard to have a UI in addition to a designer, or maybe inside the designer where you have a little chat window where you can start typing in very similar to Office 365 Copilot, which integrates with Excel, PowerPoint, Word, Outlook, all of their tools. And so it's like Clippy, but on I don't know what kind of steroids those are, but crazy.
Yeah. I like Clippy.
Oh, you like Clippy? Huh?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I meet the real Clippy in MVP at Seattle.
Oh, really? You
Yeah,
met
in
the
the
real
MVP
Clippy?
summit. Yes.
Nice. Yeah. So Clippy is here to stay.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, that's all I had.
Thanks. That's great.
Thank you. Thank you for attending, and I'll catch you hopefully next week.
Yeah, sure.
All right. You have a good one.
Yes, thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.